Coming up in this video, the backstory behind some of my favourite autumn photographs I've taken this year, the how and the why I edited them. Well, good morning everybody. Now I should really be out on a landscape photography shoot right now, but I laid in bed awake last night listening to the storm, listening to the rain pouring down, and realised that actually it probably wasn't such a good idea. And although it's a little bit better this morning, I've still decided that I'm going to work on my end of month roundup video. So what are we going to talk about this month? Well, I've picked two photographs for you, two autumn photographs taken on two separate shoots. Both are really local to my home, so that works out really good for me. And the reason that I've picked them is because when I did a talk for a camera club last Thursday night, somebody made a comment on how little editing I actually seem to do on my images. It started me thinking about the way in which I took these and the way about I edited them. And I made the connection between a book which I've read many times, which is the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And there's a message in that book that basically says you can be efficient with things, but you can't be efficient with people. But you can be effective with people. Brought me to realise that equally this idea is also true with photography and art as well. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you imagine as an artist trying to go out and be efficient in that you take as many images as you possibly can in a set time frame, that would be efficient. And same with painting, pottery or anything. The amount that you put out in amount of time. But photography and art or anything like that, any creative medium isn't like that. But you can be effective. And for me, being effective with your landscape photography and with your art is about getting across the idea, telling people in one photograph, in one image, what it is that made you want to stop and tell other people about what you had seen and how you were influenced and how you were affected by it. And I think it's this approach to landscape photography that means that regardless of what the landscape throws at us, regardless of how autumn actually behaves, whether we get fantastic sunlight, whether we get beautiful orange and yellow backlit leaves on the trees, or whether we just get green and the sludgy brown and a slow slide into winter, it doesn't matter. Because as photographers and artists, we can respond to those landscapes and create our own individual images which mean something and connect with us. And I really do think that this approach out in the field when I'm taking my photographs means that because I always have already created a strong idea in my mind of what I want the finished image to look like, means that when I take the picture, I'm almost there. And the role of editing then is just to emphasize those points and try and get those things over to the viewer in a much more concise and effective manner. Okay, so let's take a look at the first picture. So when I went out on this particular shoot, and I'll put the image up on the screen for you in a moment, I knew that it was going to be really quite difficult to actually capture some autumn colours in the trees. It didn't bother me too much because I thought there was going to be a lot of other interest around, and I knew that up in this location there would be a lot of brown bracken and things going over hopefully, and just not quite collapsed yet, so I could capture some of that, some nice good autumn sort of colours. And that's essentially what I found. But I was thinking about sort of getting some trees against it. I was thinking about some dead wooden logs and some fallen branches and things. And I found those as well. And those worked out really well. But the photograph which I took, which I'm going to show you now, is the one which I hadn't expected to take. It was the one that I found whilst I was walking around. And it's the image that I reacted to the most, the one that summed up the feeling of that morning. When I was up there looking out towards the moorland over the top of the village where I live, you could see the fields just beyond the houses and you could see the open rolling moorland behind that. And the way it was illuminated by this very soft early morning light. And it was that really sort of drew me to look out across and look at the larger landscape rather than some of the details that I had been looking at previously. So in this picture, what was important to me was actually managing to capture that light and that effect and that colour on there. Now, I'm not going to go into all the editing and things on this image. We're going to do it a little bit in the next one. But what I wanted to do was exaggerate those details which were really, really important to me. So when I took the picture, I took this in mind. I knew that I had to capture those bright orange and yellow backlit fern leaves in the foreground and sprinkled throughout the scene. I knew that I had to get that nice side lighting across the trees, and I knew that I also had to capture that soft warm light in the background as well. So that gave me some exposure issues, so I actually ended up taking a number of different bracketed exposures just to make sure that I got the one that I wanted. And it was this image here that I eventually decided to edit. I also wanted to make sure that although the background would be largely overexposed, that it was still important to the image. I didn't want it to be diminished in its importance to the foreground. So I shot at about 135mm, which was about the longest sort of focal length I could get, and maintain the composition. And the reason I did that was because it drew the background forward. So a long focal length lens will compress perspective, whereas a wide angle will exaggerate it and make parts of the image look further apart. I also knew that although I was quite happy with the tree being out of focus and the background out of focus, that I didn't want everything to fall. So I shot at f16, give me that little bit of extra depth of field, and focused on the leaves in the foreground, making sure that that fern was going to be pin sharp. And to make sure that it was pin sharp, I also had to shoot at a high enough shutter speed to cope with the slight wind that we had. So I selected an 80th of a second. Now in editing, I've warmed the image slightly. I've saturated the yellows and the oranges. I've put a bit more warmth into the highlight, and believe it or not, I've actually added a slight vignette into the corners just to draw your eye slightly more into the frame. If you want to watch this video, then I'll put a link to it in the description, and also I'll put a card up here now so you can find out more about the taking of this picture. It was this video and this picture that really sort of got me thinking more about landscape photography and autumn colours, because after I put this video up for you guys to see, I got some feedback and comments about the fact that actually there were some good places with autumn colour left in them. And that's when I started thinking about, well, maybe if that's the case, I should get out and have a look at some other images. So let's just cut across now and take a quick look at another image that I took. And we're going to go through the editing as well. So this second photograph I took a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and it came out on last Wednesday's video, and I'm really, really pleased with it. The reason I think I'm pleased with it the most is because it really does come very close to what I saw and what I wanted to show the readers when I was at the waterside walking along this path. It really does bring out everything in the scene that I wanted to show you. So when I took the picture originally, and we'll have a look at the original, shall we? So the original exposure looks something like this. Quite bright through the image. We were obviously in a very shady sort of area, so the cool tones are coming through in the shadows. We can see some warmth in the background, but because of the autumn colours, it didn't feel cool or cold. It felt very, very warm. So let's go through what I did to get it from this up to this. So I'm going to turn off the edits that I've actually produced just to sort of give you an idea of everything that I've done so far. So this is the original image without any edits being made to it. So as you can see, it's actually quite cool compared to the finished image, and the reason for that is because the lighting temperature, the shadows were very, very cool. Although the sun's coming out and you would think it would be quite warm, because I'm effectively in shadow, those cool tones are coming through. The water was naturally quite a bluey green colour as well and didn't have that warmth. But it was autumn, and really it did feel quite warm and quite autumnal. It didn't feel like it was cold in any way at all. So it was that warmth that I wanted to come through the picture. So the first thing that I needed to do when I did that was to address those colour issues and try and get that warmth back in. And I did that by changing the colour temperature. In fact, it's already at 7,200 here, but I actually increased it quite a lot. I brought it up to its custom setting of 9,429. So I really have increased that colour temperature. What I've also done at the same time is I've increased the exposure slightly, because increasing that exposure just gives those shadow areas a little bit more light into them. But I've not wanted to do it too much because the actual real dark areas themselves I've pulled back a little bit. So what I've also done is edited the exposure slightly. I've increased it ever such a bit. And the reason I've done that is just to add a little bit more light into some of the mid-tone areas. But I wanted the shadows to remain fairly dark and keep that feeling of this light and airy scene being framed. So I've put a little bit of exposure to pull the shadows back down -16, and I've pulled the blacks down -4. But I still felt that there's quite a bit of coolness to the water. So up in the highlight areas, I've just added a little bit more warmth using colour grading. And you can just see the effect of switching that on and off. And although the image is greatly improved here, I just wanted to breathe a little bit more of that life back into it. And I did that by using some new features inside of Photoshop, using the masking techniques. So let's just run through some of those masks. So when we switch the mask back on, you'll see that the image really is transformed. And the first one is to darken down this little bit of water in this area over here, which is highlighted. And the reason for that, without it, that just detracts and takes your eye out of the frame. The top area of the frame needed a little bit of lightness in it. It needed a little bit more light and airy feel, something to actually bring that out. And I also put a little bit of negative haze on there just to make it a little bit soft, so it draws your eye back in. The rock was too dark, and I wanted that to come out a little bit more and act as a fixed point for you down in the foreground. So I lightened the rock just a little bit. And then this section here, this section needed to be a little bit lighter, a little bit more saturated, and have a little bit more punch to it. So I adjusted that separately, because that was the bit that in the landscape that actually took my eye and drew me down into the scene. So I've given that a fair bit of consideration. And it was also important that I maintain this framing effect. So to do that, I've added a vignette and pulled the exposure back on that as well. And that just gives me enough to make me pull everything back exactly how I'd want it to be, just to make sure that we're focusing our eyes where they need to be. And finally, the water itself. I didn't want the highlights to be burnt out. I wanted to retain some detail. So I've just reduced some of the highlight detail in the water itself, while still keeping that nice blue shimmering light on it. Let's put that final picture up now so that you can see it. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video and you found it useful. Maybe it inspired some different ideas on how you take your photographs and how you edit. If it has, then why not put some comments down below so I can find out about what you're thinking on the images and what I'm doing. So if you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to find out more about the backstory behind these photographs and these pictures, then why not actually subscribe to the channel? There'll be a link coming up at the end where you can do that. Until then, get out, enjoy your photography, and I'll see you in the next one.